Good day to everyone. My name is Chris Abani, and it is my privilege to host the first event of Northwestern University's Program of African Studies Fall Calendar. Gracing us today is a man who needs no introduction and who is one of the greatest thinkers and writers of the 20th and the 21st centuries. Nobel Prize winner and committed human, a man who, when I was struggling to put together an introduction for, my friend, Egyptian writer Matthew Shinoda, jokingly said, anyone who does not know this man should unplug their Zoom and go to their room. This is my quintessential Oga at the top, Professor Wole Soyinka. Prof. Soyinka Beleza, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So it's the wonders of Zoom. We're in different countries and we're having a conversation, which is wonderful. My Baba Ifa calls it Akoshe Oyibo. so I'm really grateful to that. So, but mostly for the benefit of those watching, and I'm just going to sort of, as I'm sort of saying this to everyone, I have 4 questions to put your way, and then if there's time, then we'll take questions from the audience. So I'm just going to jump straight in. I know your time is precious, so I want to have you for a little while. So Prof, one can argue that your work, your politics, and advocacy breaks down to one common drive: an unflinching and an uncompromising commitment to the centering and normalizing of human dignity in all aspects of life. And this is a generalization, but I think it really all comes down to the notion of human dignity. You've spoken out against the assault to human dignity via imperialist religions, corrupt political climates across the world, racism, environmental ignorance, and much, much more. In fact, way back, one of your first poems I read in school was published in '62 in England, and it was called Telephone Conversation, where we're kind of confronting the racism of the UK towards Africans at the time. So I would like to ask you, what sustains you in this push towards the insistence on human dignity, which, no matter the political engagement you choose, is this underlying idea? And what has changed, if anything, between when you wrote Telephone Conversation to say this global movements now by younger people with the Black Lives Matter movement and the environmental movements? Do you think more people have begun to demand for dignity? And just what is your observation as you continue to work tirelessly in this kind of way to highlight the erosion of human dignity?
Well, I've given quite a bit of thought to this because it comes up occasionally. And I think it has to do with with an unusual and rather acute powers of observation, noting differences. I grew up in a typical Nigerian family, African family. You have the children, you have the extended family, you have the waifs and strays, you have children being brought to the family, to my parents, for instance. We were not exceptional, saying, "Oh, this is my child. Really look after that child. I want this child to be brought up properly," and so on and so forth. And I noticed that, at least in my family, my parents took exceptional care to ensure that those who were not actually of the immediate family were treated fairly and equally. Now, they did not completely succeed. There's always, the effort is there. The ideal was stressed. I didn't always work that way because we interacted also with other families where you could see the omodo, that's the housemaid, the houseboy.
Right.
And they came from all over the country, by the way. We had quote unquote houseboy from Benin. We had strays from the ones from the north. And whether you liked it or not, that was a difference. But my parents did make an effort to minimize that difference. The worst crime you could commit when I was a child was to deliberately treat an omodo, a house boy, a husband, like a servant.
Mm.
But I noticed also there was a difference between the attitude in my home and in other homes where we went to, where these kids were treated like rag. They were just like slaves. Now, it was easy to sort of go along with that sense of privilege. But for some reason or the other, I preferred it. I preferred the way my parents treated us, placed us on an equal basis, level with the house help, the housemaid. So I think that's where it began, because I've given it a lot of thought. One chooses, how did I choose that way rather than to put on airs of son of the family as opposed to the others who were obviously poorer. They were being trained by my parents, pay their school fees, put clothes on their backs. The parent would come in a kind of subservient way to my parents to thank them, saying, beat them properly if they misbehave and so on. So the differences were there still from childhood and, of course, between my family and other families. And I rather preferred it that way, with my parental approach. They were interesting, like my own sisters and brothers, and I just could not conceive of them as being inferior to me. Now, from there, you go to school. You go to school, we're talking about dignity now. I was very small. I went to school very, very early. And of course, there were the bullies. Oh, yes. And remember, it was a boarding school after I left Abeokuta and went to Ibadan. Boarding school. I had these big, huge monsters who thought you were small. You were there to be treated like the omodo, the housemaid, who I had treated as equals, which I thought was grossly unfair. And so I fought my way through secondary school. I got into trouble with the school teachers also for being unnecessarily aggressive. And I teamed up with other smaller boys in my class. It was a male boarding school. Where necessary, we teamed up, called it Alliance, my history books, to fight those big boys. Right. So I grew up all the way recognizing the fact that a certain factor of human relationships was one of domination. There's always a tendency to dominate others, to bully others, to bend them to your will. And could be because of the way I've been brought up, I was not about to accept that for any reason, because of size or money and so on. And this went on again into university, where the kind of club I prefer to belong with the clubs, which did not admit of any aristocracy or class, money, means, intellect, perhaps, intelligence, but even there, I preferred helping one another through school. So that's the way it went all the way. There wasn't any conscious moment. That's what I'm trying to say. Any conscious moment I felt, I have to fight for this right, I have to fight for that. It just became part and parcel of me. And I think it began from that home family experience.
That's sort of beautiful and amazing too, because so it's like even as a child you're organizing. You're organizing.
Unnecessary to defend myself, yes. Could organize.
Yes, and that's beautiful. But then also even stories about your childhood give some indication of some of the advocacy you've done. That growing up, when I was growing up, I was born round about the Civil War. But at this time, we had shifted very much from the hope of a unified country into this deep ethnic nationalities, and it cost you dearly to intervene, towards peace in a civil war, of which your ethnicity really wasn't at stake, your humanity was. And that's always struck me in a country that has often been divided by small interest groups, how your choice always to move into activism, which is always controversial, is led by this notion that there is a human ethic that supersedes any other kind of interest. Would you say that's true?
Well, let's put it this way. You mentioned the Civil War. And I try to be as honest as possible in these matters. You use the word peace, and it wasn't so much peace that took me to intervene. I felt that the war was unjust. We were there, we saw what happened. Yes, all right, whatever the causes. There was a coup. A number of people felt that the coup was one-sided, pitted one ethnic group against another or others. All that could be true, but what we saw, what we experienced was the hunting down of innocent people, even sometimes into Lagos. As I've written somewhere, my wife's wardrobe was depleted in I just used to take them to assist some of the Easterners to get out of the clutches of some of the marauding soldiers. And when war started, I just felt that the war was wrong. At that age, I don't think one thought very much about war being basically wrong. I mean, after all, as a student, I felt that with others that we were to go to South Africa and liberate South Africa from that degrading condition under apartheid. This we thought was our destiny, and we prepared towards it. So it wasn't peace as such. Today, I can say very honestly, I find war stupid. At the time, I did not. I felt that was just what we were as human beings. That's what the history books largely were all about, just war, war, war. And if that was our destiny, well, the only way to maintain our dignity, that's what it had to be. So it wasn't peace as such. When I moved over to intervene, it was to say to my colleagues over there, look, there can be a way out. If there's going to be war, at least let there be a third force. I wasn't the only one who thought that way. We felt that they shouldn't fight an isolated war against the rest of the nation because they had already been clobbered. The Biafrans had already been sufficiently degraded, dehumanized, butchered right all over the country, except in some areas which managed to secure them. So we didn't think it was fair that they should fight this war on their own against the others. And we felt that if there was a third force, then we could neutralize the two sides, or at least create a kind of alternative to this uneven and unjust war. So it was more a sense of justice than peace, is what I'm really trying to stress. And the activism, for me, this is just part and parcel of my activism, that I didn't see, after this was just pouring injustice on injustice by the federal side going to war against the Igbo, especially at that time.
Yes. That's really so. I'm still unpacking this first question, which is beautiful, and so I want to go back to this the notion of the urge to dominate. This idea that a group feels that they have, it's almost like an entitlement. There's an ideology that is used to justify this, and one of the beautiful ways you sort of articulated this the distinction between a sort of particularly Yoruba, but I would say generally Nigerian and West African indigeneity, and sort of this idea of larger dominations who are either Western or have sort of imitated Western dominance as being through religion, and sort of separating the idea of religion and spirituality. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of how you're using this idiom and also the ways in which for you, indigeneity was almost a mystical path. It was always about questions and innovation. And what we have now is sort of the deadening of that. It's sort of almost the way in which religions are deadening the ability of certain people to innovate, to champion the human element, so to speak, for progress, for unity, for this dignity.
Well, you mentioned religion, and of course, for us, this is a very critical issue at the moment. And also look at this problem with religion in a large historic context. And I end up saying quite candidly that I think sometimes I believe that religion as such owes the world an apology. Because the amount of the horrors religions, especially Christianity and Islam, have wreaked on the world, historically and continuing till now. As such, I mean, I'm talking about religion being cited as justification for going to war, for oppressing, for torturing, historically and up to now. And of course, it is part and parcel of this instinct to dominate. Religion becomes conflated, in fact, with an unequal human relationship. And so I view religion with suspicion. I admit, and I always insist on this, that religion has also contributed a lot to the finer sensibilities of human beings, of society. Look at the arts of religion, and which have been inspired by religion. Whether you're talking about painting, music, sculpture, even architecture, really awe-inspiring. And this takes its place from religion. And so I separate genuine believers from those for whom religion is just an instrument of domination. And unfortunately, that is what we are witnessing in Nigeria today. That is what is being used to absolutely brutalize and destabilize entire society. And therefore, religion is losing respect even from those who normally would want to pay tribute to religion's contribution to civilizations. What we see really is the domination of the human being. That word submission, by the way, submission, which has been cornered, almost like a kind of holy passport to terror by some religions, that submission to the will of God, submission to Allah. In actual fact, what they're saying is submission to me, the preacher, the mullah, the cleric. It's they who create God in their own image. And because they're bullies and terrorists instinctively, they're psychopaths, many of them, they latch onto God as an excuse. And so they don't even allow those who are normally spiritually inclined to pursue their own spirituality, to probe the inside of them and work out their own relationship with phenomena and other and fellow human beings. And so they speak on behalf of God, and they are as remote from God as the North Pole. You don't even know what it is. They never. But it's very useful, you see. And so they create scriptures on behalf of the God whom they do not even know. So religion, for me, is now a problem. And anybody who says it isn't is just deceiving himself or herself, which is a real problem. Whether we have to convoke a world assembly of secularists and religionists so we can sort this thing out once and for all, I don't know. But right now, we must protect ourselves from the dominant streak of religion. And the same thing with ideology, secular ideology. If you look at the history of some of the most progressive, quote unquote, countries in the world, and you see the conduct of those who preach an egalitarian ideology, you find it in, whether you're talking about Ethiopia under the dirt, or you're talking about Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, talking about Germany under Hitler, preaching the purity of races. No, it's all about domination. Domination and a class apart from the rest. The privileged who share the what we call it, the dividends, not the dividends of democracy this time, as we like saying in Nigeria, but the dividends of power among themselves. And they become the elite. And it's this instinct we destroyed communism, this power. Because sooner or later, the world turns and says, wait a minute. It's not really about ideology. Right. It's about privilege. Right. It's about domination. Right. It's about bullying, to put it at its crudest form. Right. To sit on top of the pile and then thunder down the scriptures, whether secular scriptures or religious scriptures, and the rest of humanity. That's what destroyed communism and changed around the very shape and color and ambience of the European world.
That's incredible. And so just to sort of bring back the element of the indigenous system. So sort of in contrast to all that, indigenous systems do the exact opposite of that, or
the indigenous religions, you said?
Or at least, I don't call them religions like Ifa or Orisa. It's not a religion, more so as it's almost a practical way of living an ethical life. But as you pointed out, they don't seem to have never gone to war for any reason that has connection to these ideologies at all. Rather, they seem to be always dismantling and reinventing themselves, so to speak. Okay, I'm curious about that loss of indigeneity and how we bring thought into the West.
See, the difference teaches us, the difference in conduct instills a lesson that there's a difference between spirituality and religion. Some call it organized religion, whether it's scattered or not organized. Once there is a kind of authoritarian aspect to spirituality, in which you wish to control the other person's spirituality, you're already establishing a principle of religion. And these so-called world religions have a lot, I'm glad you mentioned, Brother Sabah, have a lot to learn from religions which they despise, which they don't even know, they don't even understand, they don't know the Orisha. There's one idiot who constantly in Nigeria actually conflates a belief in Islam or Christianity as a sign of intellectuality. That is how backward some thinkers are. He writes, each time I say anything, you see after this one, there'll be an article by him. I don't even have to mention names. I don't want to dignify him. It's an obsession with him. And for him, this fanatic Muslim, in this particular instance, for him, anybody who does not accept Islam is an idiot. We just wonder, who's the idiot? The one who kills people on behalf of his faith or her faith, or the one who says, listen, find your own spiritual balance with nature, with the world, with ethics, extract the most noble aspects of any religion for the enhancement of humanity. But leave alone one's own interior response to the phenomena around one. Commune with your deities or your single deity, whether it's a he or a she, is no business of yours. If you say this is an omnipotent, omniscient entity, can be any gender, can't it? Yes. But these
and all gender.
These fanatic, they say, oh yeah, the moment you say there's a possibility that it might be a she, they want to kill you. I mean, what kind of religious thinking is that? I mean, how do you say you're close to this deity, and yet you want to describe in great detail even the gender? I mean, this is stupid.
Yes.
Especially when you reach the point where you want to kill.
Yes.
From your point of view. So just leave people alone, whether they say they are Buddhists or Zoroastrians or Muslim or Christians or Jews or Hindu or whatever, and then meet during the rituals, the ceremonies of those deities, and go home and commune with your deity. That's my attitude to it.
I see. Thank you, Prof. So the last time we had a public conversation, you and I, was at the New York Public Library, and it was the day after Trump had been elected into office, and you were visibly upset. And today we're having this conversation one day after Nigeria's independence celebration, 60 years. So it obviously inevitably leads us into the questions around democracy, which you've been engaging with for a good part of your life. And so I'm wondering, we'll talk about failing democracies. I think that America, for instance, is going through the process of a failing democracy. But in Nigeria, I'm still hopeful because I think we're still an emerging democracy. And I don't think the evolution is actually towards the West. I think the evolution is back into more traditional ways of thinking about democracy. But what is your... So in the uprise of all this, the uptick of all this, particularly in all the larger failing places, is this an uptick in violence, like ethnic cleansings in some places, sort of now violent racism in America. And growing up in Nigeria, from when you did all through the British and all our dictatorships and the wars, so we're no strangers to violence ourselves. And so I'm wondering, do you have... Well, first of all, what are your thoughts on these failing democracies, and is there hope for them? Like in Africa, can a return to a kind of Pan-Africanism help to regulate? And what is your position really on how much of a pushback against violence should be violent or not violent? It's sort of a difficult question, but I'm sort of asking you, where do you stand in relationship to how pacifist should we be in response to people who have refused to engage rule of law, who've refused to engage diplomacy? What is an average citizen's duty in that sense?
Well, you put so many questions in that one question. Yeah, so I'm going to go back, especially I'm going to go back to some observation, which I think is very necessary for the edification of some of our countrymen and women in particular over this issue of American democracy. And to be able to answer your question properly, I must go all the way back to this, the coincidence of this encounter between us. Because if you remember, I did say, we met, and I had an engagement at the New York Public Library the day after the elections. And some of your countrymen and women of mine said, yes. Yes. Yeah, sometimes we wonder where some of them actually dropped from, but anyway. And many of them said they went hysterical. Some of them went literally insane. Yes. Because they felt, they said, oh yes, he said he would tear up his card if Trump won. What is he still doing there? Yeah. I said, why should I jump on a plane when I have an engagement with you? I'm going to finish my business before I got my card or leave over. And many of them, of course, it's amazing when you talk about failure of democracy. Sometimes the failure comes from the people themselves, not from the dictators. They turn themselves into slaves, into mental slaves. Mm. I warned, and the distinction is important, that this threat, I made it before the elections, not even after the elections. In other words, I was not protesting an election. I was warning the American people. And at every opportunity, I was telling them, if you're not careful, this man will win. He was appealing to a very raw, crude, populist nerve in the American psyche. And I saw this, and I saw a complacency I mean, I said it on a personal level. I said it to students, and it's not like in this particular case. I said, this man will enter the White House. If that happens, I'm tearing up my green card. So it was a warning. Yes. More than anything else. It was actually appealing to those who had influence to wake up, to see that something was being let loose on governance and on the American people, which they would regret. I say this because it's not often, I don't enjoy saying, well, didn't I tell you? No, but sometimes I think it's very necessary. Right. It's essential, especially as right now, if they're not careful, this thing will happen again. And somebody who's recognized this was Michelle Obama. I read something which she said, and she's also issuing this warning. And if Americans say, oh, this man has shown himself up for what he is, anybody who doesn't know it by now is a fool, and they don't go out to vote, this man will come back into the White House. And so once again, it's a warning, but this time not backed by any card, because I no longer have a green card. I'll cut it up. I have nothing else to cut up. And then the Nigerian countrymen and women then took this, what shocked me, really what shocked me, and I found nearly unforgivable, was to start taking the side of this man who's there now. I remember some of the comments when I said, listen, it's a danger to democracy. In one of the interviews explaining why I was taking, so this man is a danger to democracy. He's going to build walls. He's going to encourage racism, racist violence. During the run-up to the election, for instance, more blacks were killed by police than many years before, simply because of the rhetoric of this man. The rhetoric encouraged the worst of the slave owners who made up that society, build the wealth of that society on the back of blacks. So nothing surprised me when the racist killing escalated and so on. I didn't say I told you so, but I hope people were drawing lessons from it. And it is that kind of mentality in our people. Sometimes, in the case of Sani Abacha, for instance, when we're moving all over the place, mobilizing and so on, I would meet Nigerians, and they would say to me, oh, this man is mending the roads. If you see the number of roads is mended now, and in fact, it's closing down some banks. I got that feedback from our own people whom I met at the airport. Said, oh, Prof, you know what you're doing, but this man, I could not believe it. I said, have I been born into a slave plantation, mistaking it for a nation, or at least a wannabe nation? And I'm afraid a number of Americans are also like that, very much like that. Here is a man who literally wakes up for breakfast to a lie. He tells a lie, and he tells a lie for lunch, and then he goes to bed with a nightcap, lies. He just smashes out on. And how is it possible for anybody to even want to vote that man? And yet, I watched his campaigns, and people are turning up and cheering him and carrying banners. And I looked at one stage of the poll and I said, here we go again. Right. I don't think it's likely this time. At least it's less likely than before, but it's not impossible. Trump has virtually destroyed America. In Nigeria, we say Nigeria is a failed nation. Yes, it is. But America is going to be a destroyed nation. It'll just implode if they vote Donald Trump back in power. There's enough to have impeached this man several times over, including failure to pay taxes. Right. You pay tax, I pay tax. I've been taxed out of my senses in the United States. Exactly. And yet here's the president of a nation. And at the very beginning, remember, he was pulled up. Declare your taxes. Did he ever do it? No. And to reason assembly, he was actually compelled. And so this man at the top has been getting away with murder, literally getting away with murder. And yet there he is. He still has a following. America's reputation in the whole world is abysmal, at an abysmal low. Never before have I known a nation fall down so low in the regard of the global community on so many levels. So it's up to the Americans. I'm not part of that community. I've just been telling my friends, as I did before, please get out, mobilize, and stop whining about unimportant matters. Just get him out of that place.
So without, so talking about mobilizing, for instance, I just wondered, do you follow the amazing, what some of the amazing young Americans are doing, particularly with things like the Black Lives Matter? Are you following that? What do you think about that? During Abacha's time, it's in one of your memoirs, so I'm not telling any secrets here. You were open to mobilizing some of us to have if necessary, an armed response if the international community wouldn't take him down. Do you think there's what is there a balance between how far we should push when we're trying to restore order, or is that a slippery slope? I just wanted to push a little bit on that to see what your thoughts were. Not that I'm conflating Black Lives Matter with any kind of violence, but I'm sort of saying, should they push harder? Should Black Americans push harder? Should white Americans push harder? Are we pushing hard enough?
I think that Americans, you touch a very difficult dilemma, a really troublesome dilemma for me. The issue of how far does one go to restore one's dignity, whether it comes under the rubric of democracy or another system. How far can one go? If you see your own people being brutalized under a system, do you have a responsibility or not, if necessary, to resort to the same kind of violence to push back the violence being done against you? Ultimately, it's individual decision. In the case of Abacha, things reached a stage where definitely I backed I became part of the movement to prepare, if necessary, to remove Abacha by force. There's no denying that. I think everybody knows that now. You had a situation where people were being tortured, parents were being taken hostage and tortured to get information out of them about so-called dissidents, people being pauperized deliberately. There were murders, right, left, and center, so-called dissidents. We were living under terror. We've been reduced to a slave plantation at the whim and caprices of mindless zombies who happen to have the gun and the uniform. What do you do under circumstances like that? Okay, in America, you still have a system which works. It's been degraded by this man, this individual. Sometimes you wondered if it was there. Look at the indecent haste with which he wanted to, still planning, I imagine, to replace a member of the Supreme Court. Right. Look at his statements about not guaranteeing a handover if he loses. Look at even close to being treasonable pronouncements and conducts and associations. But the system is there, the structure is there. In the case of America, I don't think that America will go back to the days of Weathermen, Black Panthers, and so on. No, I don't think so. But there will be, whether people like it or not, there will be a more militant response to to oppression and to extrajudicial killings. There will be an increase in impatience with government, which will manifest itself, perhaps in violent protests. You might have the sporadic killings, such as like the murder of some policemen as a response to Black Lives Matter. You will have those aberrations, but it will be seen that these are aberrations. It won't be, I don't think America will go back or should go back to the days of, as I said, the weathermen, Black Panthers. I don't think so. I think the structure can survive Trump, and the structure can tame, however incompletely, the Donald Trumps of the world. If things, however, move beyond the present stage of marginalization of a section of the people of society, then they shouldn't be too surprised if the militancy becomes organized. Right. And that really, coupled with the terror strikes from other directions, will really make America implode. So ultimately, and finally, in the United States, no matter what Trump says, the vote counts basically. Yes. You know, it'll take maybe a couple of 100,000, maybe. Remember this, the history of the what's it called, the Chad. So you know those. I forget on who's reign. Okay, you have aberrations like that, but basically the vote counts. It's when the votes do not count that people become really desperate, where people are being turned voiceless and feeling impotent. But as long as the votes count, I think we can say that this is a different scenario than, let us say, under Sani Abacha, where, in my view, violence would have been justified.
Thank you very much. That was a difficult thing to engage with. And once again, I should clarify that one of the things that's more, and I'm just clarifying for the audience, that one of the things that's most admirable about the BLM movement is, in fact, that, as you say, they've increased militancy without crossing into any kind of violence, which is a beautiful thing. Let me switch gears a little bit and talk a bit about diaspora. So the African diaspora has always been something that you have engaged with, and I'm using that term loosely, but I think the whole concept of a modern West African, and I'm using this term modern in the sense of sort of like a balance sometimes between what is organically homegrown and what is sort of westernized or other, can be borrowed directly from sort of political movements in the Caribbean from the 19th century, early movements in the 20th century. Like a lot of our early leaders were students in America, and there's sort of this way, and then, you know, the artistic influences, the sort of people enslaved from parts of Africa who developed the blues, and the blues travels back with African-American sailors and is taught on the docks of Accra, and then high life emerges from all this. So there's a constant conversation going back and forth, at least artistically. And you've been someone who's highlighted it in the past, and even in recent interviews you've talked about it. So for me, I'm wondering for you if there is, how important is a very clear and established relationship and dialogue with what we might consider the African diaspora, including islands from Cuba, including Haiti, Dominica, all the way from Jamaica into sort of the African-American context in a much more, shall we say, organized way. What are your thoughts about how the African diaspora has affected what you might think of as a continental identity, and how important is it to acknowledge, have these conversations, develop it more?
That's a question very much of interest to me, and has been all my life. I have never ceased to relate to regard the African diaspora as a continuing part of the African continent. I use the expression, for instance, that I cannot understand why Africa should be defined just by its own its saline borders when such a huge proportion of its population live outside. And the history of the dispersal is one which speaks still today to the sense of the liberated African. Unfortunately, we have been very much disturbed by the intrusion of ideological misconceptions, such as even the notion, what defined Pan-Africanism? For me, Pan-African movement reached out to the diaspora in the most natural way. It became confusing for many when the Pan-Africanism was then taken to mean the African geographical content, in other words, including the Arab part. Culture is not defined by geographical boundaries. No, we are closer on the African continent, the Black Africa, we're closer to the Black diaspora than to North Africa, which belongs to the Arab world, culturally, historically, etc., etc. And Pan-Africanism was watered down by our insisting on catering to the interests, becoming sort of indentured to the interests of the northern part of Africa. And those interests did not always coincide with our own direction for liberation, self-fulfillment, development, self-expression, etc., etc. In all this, we were closer to Jamaica, to Cuba, to even parts of the Latin American continent. But ideologically, especially when the OAU was being formed and so on, a number of leaders felt that, oh, it had to be the entire African continent. I think that is one of the grossest mistakes that we ever made. And a few Pan-African conferences that I did attend at the time, you found this quarrel, this dispute, even in Festac, the cultural festival, 77, yeah. The issue came up and we began, the Black African countries south of the Sahara began knocking each other's head. The North must come in. This is backwards to think in terms of, for heaven's sake, who were those who underwent this massive depopulation? And by who? Who were depopulated, both towards Latin America, towards the Caribbean, etc., and towards the Arab nations. In other words, we were enslaved both by the Arabs and by the Europeans. Right. And so there's a commonality of interest with our own degraded people, far more than with those who degraded us, whether northwards or westwards. And so, personally, I have retained this sense of the diaspora being part and parcel of the African continent, no matter what the ideologues have to say on the subject. And as I was able to become my own person, I found myself almost immediately visiting the United States, the Black sections, touring the Black areas there, relating to the artists, the poets, the playwrights, the novelists, going to Jamaica, Cuba, etc., and finding there a continuity of interest. When I go to Haiti, for instance, and I visit Soufriere, what's the name of that marvelous castle, I feel like this is part of our own continent. Right. I mean, I share in it. It's my blood, which is it's my people who built it. Yeah. I can't have the same sense of ownership, northwards. No, not the same thing. So it's a visceral thing. Yeah. And to go back to what we were saying earlier, it's one of the reasons why even the politics of the United States remain very strong with me. What happens there for me, because there's such a large population there, because we, the Black people, built the economy of that place, I feel that we have a voice much stronger than many people try to credit us with, a very strong voice in the fortunes, even of the United States, because we built that place.
Right. I see. The last question, and we might have to end on this because we're running out of time, but I wanted to talk to you about art a little bit, just the plastic arts, sculpture, painting, and so forth. And your activism has extended even to that. So that the question is two parts. I remember even there was a moment, as you know, the Ori of Olokun, this beautiful bronze head that has disappeared under colonialism of Olokun, a seminal image, if not only for the Yoruba nation, for the whole, I would think of Nigeria, had vanished, and you were tracking it for a long time and tried to liberate it from many places, including the British, or considered, including the British Museum, and returning it to us. So I wanted to talk to you briefly about that idea of where you stand on this idea of artworks being returned, and if we have spaces where they can be returned to. And then secondly, yourself, an avid collector of art. In fact, I was part of an exhibition of your work in Sicily, of your private collection, and sort of your relationship to it, not just in terms of the way it's been discussed in functional terms and sort of a lot of art history, but in terms of just a kind of embodiment of an intellectual creativity. So I wondered if you just wanted to end with that, and then let's see what the time allows us.
My relationship with art is a very mixed one. First of all, well, I think we all love things of beauty. We define beauty differently, of course, but creativity itself, the shaping, the molding, the designing, and ultimate execution of private intuitions, which we then bring out for other people to share. This, I think, is germane to all human beings. But some people seem to relate to them more strongly than others, almost to the extent that they feel they cannot quite leave them alone. Whether they want to acquire them, or they want to sit down and contemplate, and so on. And this is a universal instinct. In my own case, it became complicated when I began to see our own artistic treasures being taken out. The looting, and of course, sorry, plunged into history, the looting of Benin treasures, and then the conduct of religious stormtroopers who have their own art idioms and their own traditions, and yet who come to the African continent and start burning our artworks and saying they are works of the devil. Mm. And their successors are even worse than their teachers. Mm. Have these preachers who storm out of their churches or whatever and go on a cleansing rampage. I mean, even announce it in advance. It's okay, we're going to destroy all shrines and everything inside. And they go ahead and they do. So that became also a political issue for me. And I like to collect them and preserve them. And if I see any somewhere which I know belongs to my society, which is part of my own heritage, if there's any way of taking it back, I will, peacefully. If I can do it covertly, I will. I've even proposed that when you use the word reparations, that issue of reparations, that one way of settling the matter is let all these countries, these nations, Europe, the African people, since art is the precipitate of the humanity of any people, and you rob them of that element, that commodity, you've literally taken their humanity away. So if the European world wants true closure, let's not talk about money. Let's not talk about material compensation. Just return the artworks you stole. You brought us up sometimes violently. you return that, and believe me, I'll be at the forefront of the Truth and Reconciliation panel between the European world and the African world. So just return that humanity, that precipitate humanity, which you're keeping locked up in the galleries. Believe you me, would become friends.
It's wonderful. And your own impulse to collect. It seems to, I was privileged to see some of it, and it's very carefully, it's very representative, I would say, of the vastness of Nigeria. Is that intentional, or is that simply in the pursuit of beauty?
The vastness of Nigeria, I missed that part.
Oh, well, sort of your own collection, which is in itself quite an incredible collection. Seems to be drawn from almost every ethnicity within Nigeria. So I'm curious to know if the drive is more like an archival drive, or like simply anytime, wherever you are, that you come across something and you think, oh, this is amazing, I must have it, then that's the collective impulse.
Well, beauty is not ethnically inclined. And I don't believe in quota system. I don't deliberately try to balance my country. No, not at all. It's just where my feet take me and I see things, or those itinerant vendors, they move around and they can bring something to you from Senegal and swear to its authenticity, etc., etc. And finally, some pieces I have, which I bought deliberately, because I know that they will annoy religionists, who think they're the work of the devil. So sometimes I even buy some pieces. I say, good, this one looks wicked.
It looks pretty evil.
Well, these fundamentalist Christians and Muslims and all other religions who have the nerve to degrade, to denigrate our works, our spiritual precipitates, simply because they think that God won't like it. Then I buy certain things and push it in their face and say, look at it carefully. This is God
evil.
recognizes this as the work of his own handiwork.
So we're almost completely out of time. I've been scanning the questions as I've been looking away. And something that seems to repeat in a lot of the questions has to do with sort of Nigeria, particularly in age. So it's a very Geocentric culture, and a lot of the beauty of that has been in traditional culture, how it's kept institutions intact. But I think people are now asking, is it time for this older generation who have been in power in Nigeria for 30 odd years now to cede to a younger generation, or must the younger generation wrest it from them?
Sorry, was that a question or a statement? It wasn't.
It's a question. What is your view on that issue of why there doesn't seem to be a shift generationally in power, in particularly West African countries?
In artistic approach.
No, we've gone back to I'm taking questions from the audience now. So in the political realm mostly.
Well, I don't know if he's talking about shift in artistic sensibilities. My experience is that younger people are coming around to recognize the value of their own traditional artworks. They're not quite as brainwashed as the generation before. Some of them are, I have to tell you, some of them are. Let me give you an example very quickly. As you know, there's quite a few collectors in Nigeria. And in one case, there was a young plumber, a young man, a fetish anyway, who was asked to go and work upstairs in this collector's home. And the next thing you knew, he was hearing down the stairs screaming, blood of Jesus. And he fled out of the house and was never seen anymore, simply because he had encountered some traditional works upstairs where he was supposed to do some plumbing or carpentry work or whatever. Yeah. And that was, he said, that man is a fetishist. He's a fetishist, he worships the devil, and so on. So that's an example, and it cuts across generations. But that kind of person is increasingly an exception.
I see.
I mean,
On that,
people close into their religions and the works there, and the works which emerge from them.
right. All right. Well, on that beautiful answer, I think we've come to the end of the time we begged you for, and I could go on. I would love to go on, but I want to be respectful and grateful for your graciousness. Thank you so much, Professor Soyinka.
You're welcome. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Likewise, likewise. And to everyone gathered, thank you very much. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but take care and thank you for watching. All right. I think I'm going to hit the leave button and take care. Bye-bye.